Today on the podcast, what it means to get a college education from Cambridge University, one of the oldest colleges in the world. What? Get Joe.
Get your education. Backwards education.
On today's podcast, here at the Back Porch Education Podcast, I have the joy and honor of interviewing Josie Parker today, who I have known for many years, both as a student here in America and now a student over in the UK, studying for her undergraduate degree at Cambridge University. And she received that here recently and is deciding for a little bit more torture from that institution by going on to her master's. She doesn't look at it as torture, but you hear Cambridge University and you feel like you have to put on a false English accent. But in keeping with Back Porch Education, which I think she occasionally listens to, she's brought a poem. And so, Josie, share with us your poem.
All right. Well, I feel like the relation to what we're talking about today is pretty self-explanatory, so I'll just jump right in. So this poem is called Inside of King's College Chapel, Cambridge, and it's by William Wordsworth. Tax not the royal saint with vain expense, with ill-matched aims the architect who planned, albeit labouring for a scanty band of white-robed scholars only, this immense and glorious work of fine intelligence. Give all thou canst. High heaven rejects the lore of nicely calculated less or more. So deemed the man who fashioned for the sense these lofty pillars, spread that branching roof self-poised, and scooped into 10,000 cells where light and shade repose, where music dwells lingering, and wandering on as loth to die, like thoughts, whose very sweetness yieldeth proof that they were born for immortality.
Well, that's a fine one for what we're talking about, as you said, and for some of those lines just do a teacher's heart wonderfully well. Give all thou canst. I wish more students had that mentality rather than the nicely calculated less or more. We do today have a tendency to view education in a very utilitarian way. What can I get out of it that I might get more out of a job or life or whatnot? And there is a selfish aspect to education, to be sure. But if there isn't something like a delight expressed in this poem, it very quickly becomes something to be endured rather than something to be enjoyed. And I think Wordsworth is opting for the better part of something that's enjoyable. As we get started, Josie, obviously whenever we have somebody on, I gave you a very brief introduction. Why don't you first tell us just a little bit about your intellectual educational history, who you are, where you've come from, where you're headed, and then I'll start picking your brain about college. But tell us how you got to college and then some of your purpose in being there and where you want to go from there.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Eastern North Carolina in Greenville. And basically from kindergarten until 12th grade, I attended a classical Christian school there. It was very small. I graduated in a class of 16. Buck Holler has been on the podcast before, and he was my Latin teacher all the way from 7th grade through to 12th. And I know Steve and Jason actually taught me as well a bit. So yeah, it's interesting interacting with them now, not as a student. The final couple of years of high school, I had gotten really into Latin. My senior year, I was the only person in our Latin class. So it was just me and Mr. Holler, and we had quite a good time. But I think I realized somewhere around junior year that I wanted to study Latin and classics, which includes Greek and Roman and Greek culture in general at university. So I first got put on to Cambridge while I was in Italy. So my the summer after my junior year, I went over to Italy to a Latin summer program for 2 months with Mr. Holler and Jason as well. And while we were there, I ended up meeting a few people who were about to start their masters at Cambridge and who had just finished their undergrad, so in the same position that I am now. And I remember one specific conversation where we were sitting down after dinner, just sort of chatting, and they started talking a bit about their experiences at Cambridge. And I thought, well, that sounds like something I might be interested in trying. So I sort of applied on a whim and then was very pleasantly surprised when I got an interview. And at Cambridge, I don't know how COVID's affected all of this, but they used to not do online interviews. So you either had to travel to an interview center in your country, and I think the nearest one was like New York City or something like that, or you had to travel over to the university itself to do your interview. And I figured if I'm going to be spending 3 or 4 years there, I might as well see the university.
Check it out firsthand. Don't mail it in, as it were.
Yeah,
All right.
exactly. So me and my dad traveled over there together, and I had my interview. And I'm sure we can talk a bit more about the interview and stuff later, but it's very different from what you would think of with an American interview. I interviewed with the people who would be teaching me, and they asked me basically how much I knew about Latin and classics. So I had that interview, and then I came home and I ended up getting an offer. And it's very hard to turn Cambridge down, is what I will say. So I've been over there now for 3 years, and I'm back at home now with all of the COVID stuff that's going on, but I'm planning on going back to start my MPhil in October. So, yeah.
Okay, a few questions that come out of that. Did you apply, or in particular, did you go through much of a process with any colleges here in America so that we can compare that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I did. I applied to a ridiculous number of schools. I would not recommend it to any high school students now. I applied to 15.
Wow.
It was way too many. And it was a bit torturous, but it's okay. I did it, and it's over now. But yes, I applied to many in the US.
So compare that experience. What kinds of things in particular were different between the interviews that you had here in the United States and over in Cambridge?
So I would say probably the biggest difference is what sort of things they're looking for. So in the UK and at Cambridge in particular, I ought to backtrack first. So when you apply, you're applying to study a subject. So you can't do a lot what you do in the US, where you just apply and you're sort of undecided and can figure out what you want to actually be majoring or minoring in later. In the UK, you apply specifically to study one subject. You don't have general education requirements. You go in and you study what you want to study for 3 or 4 years. So when you're applying, the main things that they're looking for is how have you prepared yourself to study that subject? What excites you about that subject? And, what you're looking to do going forward. So the essay is completely different. They're not asking you questions like, what's the most challenging experience you've had and why? Or I had one that was a frequent saying of Kermit the Frog is, it's not easy being green. Explain.
Really?
Yeah, I'm not even joking. That was an essay I had to write for, I think that was Stanford actually.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I was thinking Babylon B University or something there.
Yeah, that was,
Mercy.
I really do think that was Stanford. But so those were the types of essays I was writing for the American schools. And then for Cambridge, I just wrote an essay about why I liked studying Latin and classics and what I wanted to do going forward, which was actually a lot easier for me to write. So that was a big difference.
And does that number of things go through people's minds when they hear, and 3 years later I graduated, either you maxed out your program and sped through, or by studying just one subject, there's, I don't know, is there less hours or what? What's the explanation of the 3 years as opposed to 4? Is it?
It's the program. So classics is a 3-year undergrad in England. There's quite a few subjects that are 3 years. So English, history, classics, A bunch of the humanities are 3 years. Some of the sciences are 4 years. So engineering is 4 years. Natural sciences is 4 years. They have an undergraduate medicine degree, and that's 6 years. So it just depends on what you're studying as to how long the degree is. And part of that with classics, I think, is just because you come in with a certain amount of knowledge and all you're doing is studying classics for 3 years.
Now, as far as did they take any interest in some sort of standardized college entrance exams you may have taken, or was that not a part of their package?
They didn't care about my SATs or ACTs or anything like that. They wanted my AP exams, mostly because
Okay.
that's the closest equivalent to. They have A levels in the UK, so AP exams is what they consider A level equivalent. So they wanted my AP exams or IB if you do IB programming and stuff like that. But the interview, I would say, is probably the most important part because they want you to have those scores, but then you're talking to the people who are going to be teaching you, and they're asking you questions.
The interview is with faculty.
Yeah, so it's with the man who would be my director of studies the next year, and then also the man who would be teaching me Greek. And they had me translate a passage of Latin. So before the interview, I sat in a room by myself for 30 minutes, and I translated a passage of Latin. And then I went into my interview and they asked me to walk them through my translation. And then they asked me more questions about sort of classical literature and things like that.
In the 3 years that you were studying, did you have quite a bit of say in what you studied, or was it a pretty much everybody goes through the same program type of thing?
So I had a little bit of say. So my first year, the curriculum is basically set. So first year classics, you're doing basically the same thing as everyone else. Then second year, you start to get more choice. So second year, I could choose what texts I wanted to study. So we had modules. There were 4 different modules for Latin and 4 different modules for Greek, and I picked 2 out of those 4. And then you could also pick what additional modules you wanted to study. So there were 4 linguistics, art and archaeology, history, and philosophy. And then you could pick 2 of those 4 that you wanted to study.
So there is still some choice. It's not like everybody's doing exactly the same
Yeah,
thing.
there's still some choice. And then third year, you have even more choice than that. So third year, they just basically open the field to, they have quite a few different modules you can take, and then you pick 4 that you want to do.
Pedagogically, I went to a small college, and so I think my largest class still there was a freshman course where I'm pretty sure the auditorium was full, and it probably held about 400 students. And we had no interaction with the professor. He swooped in, did his lecture, and left. If we had logistics, we dealt with one of his teaching assistants, right? Is what you have at Cambridge a lot more personal? It seems to me that there's a great deal of interaction between a faculty member and small groups of students, if not individual students one-on-one.
Yeah, so the Cambridge model is basically split in 2. So you have your lectures, which is sort of what you would expect in an American university. I don't think mine were ever bigger than about 70, but I would have 1 to 3 lectures a day. You go in, you sit, the professor there gives you a lecture, you leave. Those are optional, so they don't take attendance or anything like that, but they are helpful to go to. And then your really important teaching all happens in things that are called supervisions. So supervisions are very, very, very small classes where you do a piece of work before the supervision. So I would do either a translation or write an essay or do a prose composition or some kind of exercise in linguistics or something like that. So a piece of work happens before you even go to the supervision. And then once you're there, where you're in a group of, I never had a supervision bigger than 4, and most of mine were 1-on-1 or 1-on-2 students. So They're very, very small. And then you go through that piece of work, whether it be your translation or your essay. And then your supervisor usually rips you apart a little bit and then asks you questions. So that's where most of the real learning happens is in supervisions.
And how often are those?
So it depends on what subject you're doing. For me, my first 2 years, I was having 5 supervisions a week, which was a
Oh
lot.
my.
Yeah, most
Oh,
most people only have like around 2 to 3, I would say. But because I had so much translation work, I would have
right.
more than that. The languages tend to have more supervisions just because you would have to do a short translation that would take you like 30 minutes to an hour and then go have a supervision on that. So I would have 5 a week. And then my last year, I only had about 1 per week, but my last year, I was only doing essays. So that wasn't as intensive, I would say.
So I'm going to ask you one question to get at another question. The first question is, let's go back to your description of rips you apart a little bit. Draw that out a little bit because if we are in fact successful here and somebody listening to the podcast goes, well, I want this for my children, they might go, whoa, 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 what do you mean by rip them apart a little bit? Talk about the criticism or explain the rip you apart a little bit.
Yeah, so it's usually very constructive. But when you write an essay, you're not expecting it to come back to you without lots of things written all over it. So normally you'll have gone wrong somewhere in your thinking because you're speaking with the people who write the books on these things. Like regularly, my supervisors, I think it's a bit self-indulgent, but they would give me a reading list to do before my essay, and half the books and articles will be written by them. And then you're like, oh, okay. um,
So, but your work would be submitted in advance of the supervision. Would you have seen the markups, or is it when you walk into the supervision that you see the markups?
Yeah, so you walk in and you see the markups, and they sort of talk you through places where they felt like your reasoning was weaker, or you need to ask more questions, or they need to sort of teach a little bit more about some specific area. And a lot of times it's helpful for essay supervisions. I found it really helpful when I had one other person in the supervision with me because then, where someone else went wrong might not be where you went wrong. And then where you went wrong might not be where the other person
Yeah.
did. And so you can sort of talk back and forth a little bit about your essays. But the nice thing about those is that none of it is graded. So no piece of work I did the entire year up until my exams had a number on it. So it's all just feedback from your supervisors. And then at the very end of the year, the way you get your entire grade for the year is these really massive exams that you take, which can be a bit terrifying, but it's nice during the year because then you're not worried. So if you write an essay and you realize, oh, I don't know anything about this, this is a terrible essay, and then you walk into the supervision, it's not going to affect your grade at the end of the year. It's much more a sort of learning experience.
There's a lot here that feels like homeschooling or something very close to it. It's you're interacting with the teacher at a very personal level. So I would assume that some of it is the look on their face or the amount of flowing red rivers of ink down the sides or whatnot. But I anticipated the fact that a lot of what we work off of, the economy of school here in America, is the grade. A good student, rightly to some extent, obsesses over that, gets disappointed with themselves or puzzled at the teacher if what they thought was a work is anything less than that, because that's the measuring gauge of how their efforts are going in class. So the UK brings forth, or at least Cambridge brings forth, this notion: we're not really going to give you any of that until the end, at least numerically. Here in mind, I remember one time you mentioned to me what you had gotten on an exam, and my eyebrow went up because Josie Parker never earned that in my class, so to speak. So, explain a little bit assessment. How do you know how you're doing?
Yeah, so well, I'll first talk about how you know how you're doing during the year. It's pretty obvious if you're not doing very well, I would say. Like your supervisors will make it clear that you need to work on certain areas. And they also write you end of term reports. So you get a report at the end of each term from each of your supervisors that will say, we're predicting that she'll do quite well on her exams, or we're predicting that she won't do very well on her exams. And so you get that from each of your supervisors. And they also give you less quantitative data as well. They're like, she needs to work on, I don't know, translating prose authors in Greek or something like that. So you get that sort of feedback throughout the year. And then at the end of the year, you take your big exams. And those exams are theoretically graded from 0 to 100, but they're really not in practice. In practice, they're normally graded somewhere between about, I don't think I've ever seen anything lower than 50, but there you might be able to get something in the 40s up to about 80. And if you get an 80, you're a genius, basically. You've written a piece of work that is publishable in a journal.
Right, because I think you told me a high 70.
Yeah.
I'm translating that into Americanese of you got a C?
Yeah.
And I felt bad for you till you explained, no, really, Mr. Elliott, that's pretty good. So it's just a different economy.
Yeah.
So we think here in America of GPA and all this kind of thing. What's the format for honors in a UK college?
Yeah, so they're called honors. So you can either get first class honors, second class honors, or third class honors. And second class honors are divided into 2 1s and 2 2s. So I don't want to get into all the specifics, but a first class is basically what you would think of as a 4.0. 2 1s are kind of mostly A's, maybe a couple of B's. 2 2s, mixture of A's, B's, maybe a couple of C's. And then a third is probably about a C. And then once you get under a third, you're failing.
Obviously, the UK system is a system from child through a higher education. Is that, I don't know a lot about the British lower educational system, but I would assume this isn't just into cold water for them, that they've been prepared for this sort of thing.
I mean, it's different once you get to university. So in high school, they do a lot more specific learning earlier than we do in the US. So they take what are called GCSEs around when you're like 9th or 10th grade. And those are really big exams. And you take probably 8 to 10 of them in different subjects at the end of your 9th or 10th grade year. And then after you do your GCSEs, you pick 4 subjects, sometimes less than that. I think most of the time people only do 3. People might do 4 A levels, and that's what you study for the rest of your high school. So they have a lot more specific learning earlier, but I think they grade on a similar scale to us. So they have like A stars, A, B, C, D in high school. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's sort of the system. Now let's get to brass tacks here. You have friends in American university system, parents that attended it as well and told you all kinds of stories and whatnot. Outside experience, the college life experience, how would you compare what you've experienced at Cambridge with what your friends have had at various American universities?
It's very different. I will say that. And also, I don't want to speak to UK universities as a whole, because Cambridge and Oxford are sort of their own breed, even in the UK.
Okay.
But my experience has been something sort of like this. So Cambridge is divided into 31 colleges. So you have the university as a whole, and then you have 31 different colleges. And those aren't colleges as in, College of Education or College of Sciences or whatever. Instead, they're more like a living, learning place. So it's where you live, it's where you eat, where you have activities, where you have specific teaching. So a lot of my supervisions would come out of college. You make friends in college, and each of them have a little bit of a different flavor. So when you're applying, you apply to go to a specific college. And I was at Peterhouse, which is the oldest and the smallest Cambridge college, founded in 1284. And it's beautiful. It's so beautiful. I love it so much. But our dining hall is actually the oldest secular building in Europe, still used for its original purpose, which is a very long, fun fact. But it's the oldest dining hall in Europe that's still used as a dining hall. So we go in and you eat your meals in this sort of medieval building, and it's been refurbished since then. The inside looks like it came out of like the 17th century ish.
Oh,
Yeah. It's but it's beautiful, and we have like formal dining every evening. So if you want to have a 3-course meal every day of the week in hall, you can. So we have candlelit formal dinners every single day, and they only cost about the equivalent of $7 for students. So if you want to do that, a lot of times you go on your birthday or if there's a special occasion or whatever, but some people go all the time. I was actually going about 2 or 3 times a week to formal hall, which is something that not a lot of my friends were doing back in the US. In general, just like, I mean, social life sort of revolves around college, and you get similar sort of things. Like you have clubs that you join and societies and things like that. You make friends outside. I lived in student accommodation the whole time. I didn't have roommates, so they don't really do roommates in the UK, but I got to be friends with people who lived in my house with me and things like that. So in some ways it was fairly similar, but there are also notable differences as well.
all right. Where are you headed with this? What you're studying? Sounds like you're studying Latin and Greek, and I want to get a master's. I'm assuming it's in the same subject.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
So I guess the start, I really like Latin and Greek. So that was the main reason why I started studying it, is because it's something that's always been really interesting to me. And I really like the literature, and I really like the culture, and learning about how the way that things that were written in Rome and Greece have affected our thoughts and our intellectual history even up until today. I find very interesting. So during my undergrad, it's a bit more broad. So I did a lot of different kinds of literature, and I focused on doing some historical linguistics. So I did some Proto-Indo-European stuff, and some Latin sociolinguistics, and then I also did some philosophy as well. A lot of Hellenistic stuff, but I did some Plato and Aristotle too. But moving forward, so my MPhil that I'm about to start is more of a research-based degree. So I'm going to be doing research on mostly the reception of Cicero in the Renaissance. So I'll be looking into the way that Ciceronian Latin is used by different people during the 16th century mostly. And I'm also going to be doing a bit of stuff in antiquity as well. But that's going to be my thesis for next year. And moving forward, I think I want to do a PhD. So I'm applying for PhD programs this fall, and we'll see where I end up. I'm going to apply back in the UK and in the US, and we'll see where I'm supposed to be.
So with a hope of teaching, I would assume, with a PhD.
Yeah. So I would like to teach at a university, I think. And if that doesn't work out, I think I would probably be happy teaching upper level Latin at a high school somewhere. But
Well, it seems to me that a lot of what you've described today has drawn some distinctions. One of the things that concerns me about education, at least as I go at it in a high school setting, is the role of the teacher and the role of the student. I find many students viewing school as something to be endured, something to be survived, something to be, if I can use this term, gamed, to get past it. Listening to you describe your experience at Cambridge, it seems like your motivation, your love for the subject, and even preparation for supervision is going to have a lot of motivation to do my best to go back to Wordsworth, right? Give all thou canst. It puts a lot more on the student, but it would seem to me like it would raise the delight level in that you're really pursuing things that interest you, rather than some of the courses I had to take in American college were of no interest to me. They were just on the list of things that I had to get through to get the degree I wanted. Wind us up today by talking a little bit about your views of why a young person should head off into higher education, what they should try and get out of it, what their motivations ought to be, that sort of thing, if you don't mind.
yeah. So I think for some people, the US system does work, especially if you aren't sure what you want to do with your life afterwards or what you're really interested in, because it allows you to sort of sample lots of different things before you decide that you want to study one thing. But for me, I already knew what I was interested in coming out of high school, and I didn't want to spend lots of time in college, like you said, taking, I don't know, college algebra or something like that, when I could be spending more time reading, Greek or Latin literature. I think that there's too many people at university these days, which is going to sound bad whenever I first say it. But I think that the university degree has become this sort of universal credential where in order to get a good job, you have to get a university degree. It doesn't matter what you've studied, really. You just have to have this piece of paper that says, oh, I went somewhere for 4 years and took some classes in something. That sort of, it means that the university degree doesn't mean nearly as much as it used to. But it also means that students who would be better off just going and starting a job, doing something that they're passionate about, feel like they have to go and study some subject that they're not interested in at university. I mean, it's been such a joy for me to be able to actually study something that I'm passionate about and that I want to keep learning more about. And I've done it for 3 years now, and I'm still not sick of it. So hopefully going forward, I won't get tired of classics yet. But I think that should be the place for university. It should be for people to actually delve into subjects that they're really interested in, not a place where people can go get a piece of paper so they can get a job. There ought to be programs where you can go get a piece of paper so you can get a job. But I think too much overlap. The university has become the place where people get that piece of paper. And I think we should source that to, technical institutions and even, some internship programs or apprenticeships, things like that are really undervalued in today's society, which I think is unfortunate because it makes the university undervalued as well, as what it should be.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with your assessment. I talk to students all the time about why you want to go to college, and I guess I could probably come up with a list of maybe 10 specific things that they look forward to in college. There was a lot about sort of social, I'm trying to avoid the word party aspects, the fun, right? That when they talk to their parents about college, that often is what is emphasized, the good times that were had, which I don't hear absent from your description of Cambridge. And I would assume many of the things that are on that list are things that you did experience at Cambridge. And I certainly don't want any student foregoing that enjoyment. But what's causing the enjoyment? And I think in many cases, the sort of party attitude of many college students in America is because they're having to endure stuff in the classroom that's not that engaging and really not anything to do with what they want.
Yeah.
So on the weekend, we kind of forget about how miserable our lives are. Whereas the descriptions I have from folks that have either here in the States or abroad found a program that fits what they're trying to become, then the actual experience of the classroom, of the conversations between, it's one of the things with St. John's again, is their Friday night conversations where this small college gathers, most everybody gathers in the green outside the dining hall after dinner and has, with the faculty present, a good rousing argument. That in a 40,000 student state university of today, that's not possible, first of all. But even if they attempted it, I think it would be poorly attended because there's so many other more interesting things to do. So the college or the university as a place of thought and interaction and this unique time in my life when I get to just sort of think a lot. I hope it's not totally disappearing, but I agree with your assessment that there's a lot of people who don't want that are in that place, making those who do want that experience a little bit harder to have.
Yeah, and I haven't even really gone into one of the big things about studying at Cambridge as well, is that you're studying with other people who are also at Cambridge. So you're studying with some of the brightest people in the world in a setting where you're interacting with them on a day-to-day basis. You're attending societies with them. We actually had, so in Peterhouse, it's not quite the same as what they have at St. John's, but we have our History Society, our Politics Society, and then the Pern Club, which is our Humanities Society. And there's also the Kelvin Club, which is the Sciences Society. But they put on talks about once every couple of weeks. And normally about 20 to 40 people show up, but you go, you listen to a talk, and then you have conversations. And it's in a nice little parlor. There's a little fireplace. And you spend a lot of time after that just sort of chatting with people about, I don't know, an interesting subject that you just heard a talk on. And I would go to stuff that I knew absolutely nothing about. Like I went to a Humanities Society talk on Chinese folklore one time, and I knew absolutely nothing about it. But going in, you can chat with the person who's given the talk, who's usually a researcher at the university or somewhere else. And you can also talk with other people who know lots of things about that topic. So that's a really cool thing that I've gotten to do at Cambridge, is meet a lot of really bright people who are also passionate about what they're studying. And there's definitely lots of social aspects. I mean, we go out to eat together. We hang out in our dorms. We stay up till like 2 chatting and things like that, that you get at an American college experience as well. But yeah, I think the people are one of the best parts about studying at a place like Cambridge and Peterhouse in particular.
Well, wonderful. Appreciate you coming on and talking with me about some of the differences and likenesses. College is a big deal. It requires, I think, in some regards, it's if you're going to go, it's a really big life directing decision. It shapes you in many ways most of us are even unconscious of. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for the poem. I appreciate you and what you're trying to do. We might have to have you back on when you're Dr. Parker and hear about that experience. But until next time, listeners, hope you've enjoyed this conversation. And as always, share with other folks about the benefits of listening to the Back Porch Education Podcast.
If you don't eat your vegetables.